Hello, everyone. This week we are going to finish up our romantic poetry section of the syllabus. So, we're going to talk about John Keats and Percy Shelley. So, what I want to do first is talk about odes and lyrics. Now, you've already read a couple of odes, but I just want to double check that we are all kind of on the same page. So, an ode is a short poem that praises an individual, an idea, or an event. So, you'll notice Ode to Dejection last week or the week before when we were introduced to Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So this week you are going to be reading Ode to a Nightingale. So it is praise for an individual. Well, if you consider birds individuals. There are three kinds of odes. So we have a Pindaric ode, a Horatian ode, and an irregular ode. So the irregular odes are not very common, so we're not going to read those types of odes. And then we have the Horatian ode, which is about intimate scenes in everyday life. But mostly our odes are going to be Pindaric odes. They have a harmonious sound. They may have irregular line lengths and an irregular rhyme scheme, but generally you see a rhyme in that type of ode. And then when we get into lyric poetry, the odes that we are reading are lyrical odes. So it's just a more specific type of poem. Lyrical poems express strong emotions, so they'll be very emotionally charged poems. They're usually written in first person, so I'm going to discuss why that is so important here in just a little bit, but they're usually written in first person, so you'll see a lot of I feel like this, I feel like that, my heart, my thoughts, my this, my that. And lyrical poems usually have a predictable beat. So let's talk first about Mr. John Keats. So John Keats was born in London on Halloween. He was very well educated and developed a passion for reading, especially poetry, early in life. But he was plagued by death. He had the worst luck. His brother, he's one of 4 children, but one of his brothers died in infancy, so when he was a baby. His father died in a horse accident when John was 8 years old, so he lost his dad when he was a young kid. And then when he was 14, his mom died of tuberculosis. So Keats became the man of the house, so to speak. He became the caretaker for his siblings. And then his brother died of tuberculosis. And not long after his brother Tom died of tuberculosis, Keats himself died in Italy. He moved to Italy and died of tuberculosis at about 25. So he was really young when he died, but there's a lot of death in a short amount of time. It's interesting to note that he was trained in a medical school to become a surgeon. He wanted to be a surgeon, but after he got into the process of becoming a doctor, he gave up medicine to write poetry. And that was kind of a bad career move. His poems were very highly criticized. Now, the odes that he published were considered masterpieces. Those were well received by the public, but his poems were highly criticized. So let's look at Keats's style. He discusses nature in most of his poetry because he's a romantic, so nature is the crux of all of their writing. But he looked at nature and beauty distinctly. He thought that physical beauty led to spiritual beauty. So when you're looking at something beautiful, like something beautiful in nature, then seeing and feeling that physical beauty of nature leads to a spiritual beauty in the person itself. He also believed that beauty was felt by all of the senses. You could see it, and you could feel it, and you could hear it, and you could smell it. And that's important to note here in just a second. We talked earlier about how lyric poems are written in first person, and so Keats is using the I, the first person I, in his poems, but I want you to understand that the I is not necessarily Keats himself. Instead of the I being Keats himself as the speaker in the poem, he's using the I to represent the universal human experience. So he believes that we all should have similar experiences, especially when it comes to nature. So when he says I, he is referring to all of us, not just himself. Let's go back to that idea of senses and feeling spiritual beauty and using all of the senses. An important term that is significant for Keats' style is this synesthesia imagery. So synesthesia means like multisensory. So when he describes things in nature, he always uses two different pieces of imagery together to create that image. So usually poets would talk about how, or authors in general, would talk about how something looks, or how something sounds, or how something feels. But Keats uses multiple senses together to create one image. So an example of that, taste the warm south. Taste and touch, which is where the warm comes in, are two different senses. So he's using two different senses or multisensory descriptions to create images in his poetry. He also had some ideas about imagination specifically. So he actually became famous for his idea about negative capability. So what that means is he believed that great minds, people who had the intelligence to really like change the world, knew that not everything can be resolved, that there are things about life that just can't be explained, that we can't think through. And for those things, we had our imagination. So he believed that imagination kind of led to this holy authority. This holy authority kind of linked reality of the world to what the world could be. So Keats's poetry, it comes from his imagination, not his experience, and it represents his vision of what the human experience should be for everybody in the world. Instead of all of the sad, corrupt, bad things about real life, his poetry was what he imagined the wonderful things about the world would be like. In much of his poetry, he seeks to compare nature to culture. So he's looking at a lot of things like death and sorrow and love and nature, and he's trying to create this understanding beyond the human mind. So he's leaning a little more towards, a transcendental experience where the words on the page go beyond the understanding of us mere mortals. So he's trying to find things in nature like, death and sorrow and love, and he's trying to compare them to the culture that he is kind of experiencing and the culture that he wishes the world could be. So in Ode to a Nightingale, it's basically about the inevitability of death as a part of life. So when we talk about romantic poets, we are looking at how they look at nature and how they describe nature and the emotional aspects of nature itself. So if you're looking at death as a part of life, then you're looking at death as a part of nature. So most of this poem is about that inevitability of death. Probably he wrote this poem in between his brother Tom dying of tuberculosis and his death from tuberculosis, and there were only a few months in between those two events. So more than likely he was looking at his own mortality, and he was, the inevitability of what was going to happen to him, and this imagination about what was going to happen once he did die. So we have some biographical aspects to Ode to a Nightingale, but for the most part, he is focusing on that inevitability of death and what dying should be like. The nightingale in many cultures symbolizes the coming of spring. So after the death of nature through winter, the nightingale comes to revive everything and bring nature to its beauty and splendor once again. So there's a case to be had here about how the nightingale in this particular poem can kind of represent that human soul. Once the body dies, like winter, the soul then is free to explore and be beautiful and be one with nature and be perfect again. So the nightingale is that representation of the soul emerging from death or emerging from winter and singing its beautiful song. So there's a lot of symbolism, a lot of deep meaning in Ode to a Nightingale. And then we have Percy Shelley. Percy Shelley was one of the most famous English romantic poets out there. He is considered to be the finest lyrical poet. He was also kind of a hothead. He was expelled from Oxford University because he published it was a pamphlet questioning the existence of God. So it was about atheism and how atheism kind of makes sense in a way. And he was kind of working through this idea of, religion and God and does it exist. And he's writing this, at the turn of the 19th century. So if you didn't believe in God, you were not accepted really in public circles. So he was expelled from Oxford University for writing about atheism. A little while after his expulsion, he married Mary Shelley, so the girl that wrote Frankenstein, who was the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, who we read about a few weeks ago. So he ran off with Mary Shelley. Mary Shelley was actually his second wife, but he ran off with her when she was 16 years old. So a little risque decision making on his part, but he was passionate about political reform in England, specifically for the working class, conditions for the working class. He campaigns for the working class conditions along with Keats, but he did that from Italy. If you notice, Keats died in Italy. Percy Shelley also died in Italy. And they were working in Italy to promote better living conditions for the people in England, and they did it from Italy to escape persecution from the British Crown. They didn't want to be labeled as a traitor and arrested for speaking out against the crown. So they moved to Italy and they spoke out against the crown from there. His style was a little more grandiose than John Keats. John Keats was a little darker. His life was kind of plagued by death. So this idea of freedom and love and happiness was a little more removed from his poetry than from Percy Shelley's poetry. Percy Shelley believed that freedom and love could remedy all of the bad things about society. As long as someone could love hard enough and strong enough and love the right things enough, that love could overcome any kind of political, moral, or social corruption. We could solve all the political problems if we just loved each other enough. Moral problems would be gone if we just loved each other enough. So he definitely had a more optimistic view of the world. He believed that the role of a poet was much greater than just being an entertainer. At the time, the published works were very popular. That is, it was like their TV. They didn't have Netflix. They had poems and books. So authors were a source of entertainment for society. And Shelley believed that the role of the poet went far beyond just entertaining people. He thought that poets had an access to subtle truths about nature, and it was the poet's job to use that access to truth to help change the world into a better place. He looks at imagination a little differently than John Keats. So John Keats is looking at imagination as this access to this holy authority. But Shelley is looking at imagination as revolutionary creativity. He thought that you could use the imagination to change the reality of the world. So he looked at nature as a refuge from the injustice of the real world. Nature was this veil between this real world that we were living in and this divine world where some eternal divine God spirit existed. So he thought that using imagination and nature together could help identify the injustice in the world and then use that creativity from imagination to change that injustice in the world. So we have his To a Skylark that we're going to kind of look at. To a Skylark is inspired by his personal experiences. So that's a little different from John Keats. John Keats was writing from how he hoped the world would be, or what his version of the world should look like. Percy Shelley is writing about his own personal experiences. So the focus of To a Skylark looks at the limitations of human existence. So humans, even the best of us, are only able to do so many things. So Shelley was kind of an optimist. He thought that, if we loved strong enough and we did all the good things, then we could change the world. So there are limitations in that way of thinking. And so To a Skylark kind of focuses on Shelley's struggle with those limitations, knowing that he can't change the world just by loving everyone, was a tough pill for him to swallow. So I have some examples from the story, or from the poem rather, about some realizations that Shelley had into To a Skylark. So he's looking at life, and it's kind of like, I don't know if you are familiar with Tupac, but in his collection of poems, The Rose That Grew from Concrete, he talks several times about how we only know good things because we know bad things. So it kind of reminds me of that thinking. We only know happiness because we've experienced sadness. Men pine for what is not. So we, as humans, when he says men, he means humans, we want things that we can't have. The idea that the laughter from the poem, the laughter is fraught with pain. So we're laughing, which is equivalent to happiness, but then that laughter is fraught with pain. So even in laughter, even in happiness, there is sadness or there is pain. And then we have this idea that the sweetest songs are those that tell of saddest thought. So the best songs, the most beautiful songs, are rooted in experience with the worst emotion or the worst experiences that we have. So Shelley is really struggling here. He's battling his own ideology about the human existence, because he believes wholeheartedly that if we love enough and if we do enough of all the good things, then we can change the world for the better, and it can be a great place to live, and all of this very happy, optimistic ideology. And then To a Skylark is almost his realization about what the real world looks like, where we only know good because there is bad. And if we eliminate all the bad, then we can't know what the good is. So his struggle through those human limitations is evident in To a Skylark. So that is it for Shelley and Keats. this week. Be sure you finish up the questions on Ed Puzzle and get that turned in. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me and let me know. Thanks, guys.